everything is awful, of course.
Yes.
And a lot of it, the first Trump term really tried to test the limits of the courts. And the second Trump term is no different. In fact, it's more unleashed, much more emboldened, and has the blessing of immunity, executive immunity, according to the Supreme Court ruling, last year. So I wanted to break it down with you about everything that's going on regarding citizenship, specifically birthright citizenship. But maybe before that, I guess just in general, like, what does it mean for this country, for any society, for any government, that the federal government is basically circumventing the right of courts, of immigration courts, of lower courts, defying injunctions, but specifically immigration courts I find really interesting, just to try to deport people either because they disagree with them politically or because, they're not white enough to stay.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's clear that we've crossed a very dangerous line. Our Constitution, even going back farther, the Declaration of Independence, everything was designed to ensure that the United States of America would never be governed by a monarch or a dictator. And how we tried to make sure that would be the case was by establishing not one branch of government, but three branches. So the Trump administration, of course, representing the executive branch here, but we are supposed to have a judiciary, judges, who can serve as an effective check against government overreach, against executive actions that are unconstitutional and illegal. We're also supposed to have a Congress that plays that role, but we're all seeing what happens when those branches are either not allowed to play the role they are meant to play or just simply refuse to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's so fitting that, I'm someone who talks and criticizes the Democratic Party for, I think, helping lay this very unconstitutional groundwork, especially when it comes to immigration. And you, as someone who's, helped raise funds to, help immigrants fight in court. To me, it's like we've long defunded immigration courts. And, again, there is very little resources in it. And that's why, in part, if you actually don't want undocumented people in this country, actually have a more robust immigration court system, asylum process, on and on and on. But, I do think, we've sort of forgotten about it. But, like now 3 weeks ago, when the Wisconsin judge was trying to effectively get control of her own courtroom and make sure that ICE wasn't, arresting people who were showing up for other cases that they had pending. She's trying to assert some sort of, jurisdiction over her own court here, and ICE is running roughshod over them. So it's like, that's the other thing is, and she's not an immigration judge. This was about a misdemeanor, but it's just something to point out. And I think you're right. We're in this like uncharted territory.
Yeah, this administration has been very clear that the goal is not to provide a fair legal process for immigrants whose legal status is being questioned. If that were the case, they would try to put more judges into immigration courts, not fire judges and force them to resign. It would be a completely different budget if that was the goal. We would put more money into the judicial system, into the courts, and maybe not so much money into sending ICE agents out into communities and to courtrooms and every other place we can think of, schools, hospitals, to try to track down people that the Trump administration has decided are not worthy of living here, which, as you said, usually means they're not white enough to live here. It's a disgrace, honestly, to how this country is supposed to work and the principles we are all supposed to be standing up for.
Before we jump into birthright citizenship, I have to get your response because I only glossed over this moment this week where the head of Homeland Security, the very head of the body that is going after immigrants who are arriving at their immigration appointments. They're checking in. These are the farthest thing from alleged criminals or people who are, traffickers. Or you think those people show up for their immigration appointments? No.
That's right.
And here is Kristi Noem demonstrating just how little she knows about our judicial system, about the legal rights of anyone who's being detained. Speaking with Senator Maggie Hassan.
Secretary Noem, what is habeas corpus?
Well, habeas corpus is a constitutional right that the president has to be able to remove people from this country and suspend their right
let me stop you, ma'am. Habeas corpus, excuse me, that's incorrect.
President
Habeas
Lincoln
corpus,
used it.
Excuse me. Habeas corpus is the legal principle that requires that the government provide a public reason for detaining and imprisoning people. If not for that protection, the government could simply arrest people, including American citizens, and hold them indefinitely for no reason. Habeas corpus is the foundational right that separates free societies like America from police states like North Korea.
Counterpoint, I think the Trump administration wants to become a police state like North Korea. But Traci, your response to this moment, this wasn't the only moment where Kristi Noem, she had 2 or 3 chances to answer what habeas corpus is. Your response?
I mean, she clearly either doesn't know what it means or is trying to redefine for the American public and for American voters what it should mean. According to her and the rest of the administration, pretty much any constitutional right that is meant to protect us, the people, is actually, per their interpretation, the right of the president to do whatever he wants. Somehow every argument comes back to that. Well, it all comes down to the president and the president and the president and the president. No. In fact, many of the rules and many of the provisions of the Constitution were designed expressly to ensure that the president could not harm the people in the ways that he is trying to do so right now. So again, it's an example of either weaponized ignorance or propaganda. I'm not sure which.
I think that weaponized ignorance is a really important point, because you see that on full display in the ways that the Trump administration is trying to weasel out of the 14th Amendment. So let's talk about it. The Trump administration issued an executive order basically rescinding birthright citizenship. There was a lot of verbiage about if the child's mother is not a citizen at the time and the father is abroad, and it effectively tries to rewrite what the 14th Amendment is. What is your understanding of this executive order, and then maybe sort of explain what birthright citizenship is and how it came to be and how it expanded?
So the 14th Amendment was necessary and was put into place in order to ensure that formerly enslaved persons would be guaranteed citizens of the United States of America. This was something that the original drafters of the Constitution didn't feel they needed to put in, and they certainly were not concerned about the legal status of enslaved people. Fortunately, after the Civil War, we put this amendment into place, again, to ensure that anyone coming after them, they originally had this in the form of a Civil Rights Act. Congress recognized, if we don't make this a constitutional amendment, some future Congress could decide to simply repeal this. We need security, we need guarantees, we need to know that we're not going to have uncertainty as to who, in fact, is a citizen and who is not. So it was put in place specifically to guarantee the citizenship of formerly enslaved persons. But it's also written very broadly. It basically says anyone who is born here is a citizen. Now, there is one tiny provision that the Trump administration is now arguing offsets the rest of what the amendment is meant to guarantee. And that is the clause that says anyone born here and, quote, subject to the jurisdiction of the United States is a citizen. So now they're arguing, well, if the parents aren't citizens, then somehow they're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, which, sidebar, that's exactly the opposite of what they're trying to say in terms of their rights to use the legal system against people who are here who don't have documentation. But now coming back to the issue at hand.
Wait. Explain that, sort of follow that logic out, which is like.
Sure. So either we have the jurisdiction to use our legal system and exercise our enforcement mechanisms against people who are here who don't have documentation or legal status, or we don't. Either they're subject to our jurisdiction or they're not. They can't be subject to our jurisdiction for one thing, but not for another thing. Right. And this goes back to the idea of interpreting any language, any amendment, any statute, anything in whatever way the president and his people decide that they should.
This has been always my thing with the very catch-22 like nature of the far right speak on immigration, where you're like, well, they violated the law when they came across this border. And it's like, whose law?
Exactly.
If you don't think they are like subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, then they're not subject to our laws. You're basically saying that. So like we're kind of in this lost in the space-time continuum of, again, I believe they're racist attacks on immigrants because you can't say both things at once. And I think that's sort of what you're saying.
Yes.
Tell us about when it was expanded, because I think this is very interesting. We'll look into what the Supreme Court said yesterday. But I don't know if it was in 1895 or if Wong Kim Ark was born in 1985 or 1895, excuse me. But the expansion of birthright citizenship to immigrants who'd just been living here, who immigrated, not people who were brought here in chains.
Yeah, so I think the decision we're talking about was, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was around 1898. And the case was about a man, Wong Kim Ark, who was born in San Francisco. He was born here. He traveled with his parents back to China, where they were from, for I think about a year. And when he tried to come back to the United States, suddenly the government tried to claim that he was not a legal citizen of the United States because of his parents' legal status. So they took this case and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which decided, and in my view, it wasn't an expansion of birthright citizenship, it was a clarification of what that jurisdiction provision actually meant. And in that case, they very clearly decided it doesn't matter what the legal status of his parents were. He was born here. He is subject to our laws. Therefore, he is a citizen. And from that point on, there has been no logical argument, at least, that anyone could say someone born here is somehow not a citizen because of something about their ancestry. It doesn't make any logical sense. It only makes sense, in my view, if you're interested in an immigration policy that is designed and built around racist ideas in order to enforce racist values. That's my opinion.
Again, a little Stephen Miller concoction. So let's look at 22 states sued Trump over this birthright citizenship executive order, a bunch of immigration rights groups as well. 3 different district court judges invalidated the order rescinding birthright citizenship, issuing this universal injunction, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Trump has a lot of problems with injunctions, obviously. And it was elevated, whether or not the injunction should stand, preventing, the EO from going into effect, was elevated to the Supreme Court. And here is Solicitor General John Sayer, who's arguing on behalf of the Trump administration, and his thoughts about, he's arguing specifically and speaking with Sonia Sotomayor, Justice Sotomayor, sort of on the history of birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment, kind of what you were saying, rewriting it as he speaks.
Right now, we have multiple courts. We have novel courts who've percolated this issue and said, you're violating precedent. Not only precedent, but the plain meaning of the 14th of the Constitution.
Respectfully, I think what we have are lower courts making snap judgments on the merits that ignore the fundamental principle of the 14th Amendment, that it was about giving citizenship to the children of slaves, not to the children of illegal immigrants who really were not even a very discreet class at that time. And that's
there
the sort
were
of
some
argument that
people in
deserves percolation.
Congress who argued against the 13th Amendment just because of that. Some people who argued against passing the amendment just because of that, because it would give citizenship to gypsies.
I think the relevant history of the 14th Amendment is the statements of Senator Trumbull, who emphasized that domicile was the key criterion. He said that in a letter to Andrew Jackson. And we've cited in our Ninth Circuit briefing a host of decisions that back that up.
Rejected repeatedly. We can go into the history of citizenship, but I still go back to my question.
Okay, so that is a little moment where she was like, okay, you're now referencing history that got rejected. I mean, this sort of deliberately, to the point you said about the clarification about if you're born here, like Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco, you're a citizen. And he's like, no, that's not what it was for.
Yeah, I mean, It's a ridiculous argument. I think he knows it's a ridiculous argument, but it's all he has because he's been put in this position of having to argue for something that directly contradicts not only the express language of the Constitution, but a very clear Supreme Court precedent that has been in place for 120 something years. Justice Sotomayor is exactly correct to ask this question. And his reference, by the way, to these lower courts making what he calls snap decisions is also another propaganda tool that this administration is using, which is constantly talking about the decisions of the federal courts and of judges as disrespectfully as they possibly can.
Yeah.
Talking about these judges don't know what they're doing. Oh, this judge was a Biden appointee.
Sure.
This judge, this judge is biased because whatever reason they want to make up. But it's this idea that the only court decisions that they think should be respected are the ones that they agree with.
And not even if they're Trump justices, right?
Right. No, it's only if they agree with that particular decision that they think it was correct and fair. Kind of the same idea of saying the election was only fair if I won it.
Well, yes, 100%. Can I ask you, Traci, about, because it's one thing to talk about the legality and it's another thing to talk about the implications. If the injunction is lifted and this goes into effect, what will this mean for millions of families and babies born into this country? I mean, it's like, are you going to back time it? Like, I'm the child of immigrants. Like, my dad, I was on a visa when I was born. You know what I mean? Like, you could back time it to say that Trump's own children aren't citizens, because I don't think Ivana became a citizen until, I don't know, the mid 80s or something. So like, but I mean, seriously though, what's the implication here?
I mean, the answer is no one knows. They don't even know what it would mean, how it would be enforced, how it would actually work in practice, because it makes no sense. This is also, it goes back to the original idea of why birthright citizenship had to be in the Constitution, not an act of Congress, because it's complete chaos. If you set up a law and a legal system that says one thing, a person grows up believing that they are a citizen, and then suddenly some other act of Congress says, no, you're not. I mean, there is no practical or logical way to deal with that and address that. I think it's all chaos, and it's all designed, again, to create a system where the administration feels empowered to do whatever it wants to whomever it wants.
The other thing that I think that the Supreme Court's been discussing, and that I think a lot of lawyers have been talking about, and I'm curious because you, through your work with Lawyers for Good Government, have raised funds for people who cannot combat and bring these cases. But in so many of, whether it's someone contesting their detention with ICE over an op-ed that they wrote, like Rumeza Osterk, or it's Kilmar Abrego Garcia, or it's someone, even an American citizen who was wrongly detained. I think we saw in Mississippi someone tackled to the ground. They're gonna need legal support. It seems like this is making far expanding sort of this legal bureaucracy and the hurdles that immigrants notoriously regularly navigate when it comes to the immigration system in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that our existing immigration system is deeply flawed, and it has been for a very long time. So far, we've not been able to pass anything resembling meaningful, logical immigration reform. What we see instead is a constant flip-flopping, constant changing in policies, constant executive action. We've seen this for years. I mean, we founded Project Corazon, which is our immigrants' rights project, in 2018 in response to the Trump administration separating families at the border, just literally pulling children out of the arms of their parents, detaining them separately, and not even tracking where those children were going.
Right.
So we were trying to respond to that. Then the next thing, now what we're going to do in order to avoid separating families is we're going to force all of them to wait in dangerous border cities in Mexico where they're not even from and where they have no resources and no connections until their case proceeds. And also where, of course, they have no access to lawyers. When that's no longer allowed, now we're going to have Title 42. We're going to not let them in, not because of remain in Mexico, but because of the pandemic. I mean, it just,
that we
it's
don't
a
believe
constant
exists.
changing. Exactly. So the the system we have now is already so Byzantine, so confusing, and constantly changing. Even lawyers have trouble keeping up with it all. So now to add yet another layer on top of it, again, I think it all comes down to what the true desire of the administration is, which is to not be subject to laws at all, to be able to say, and for all of us to know, by the way, that they can come after you, they can come after me, they can come after whoever they want and make whatever argument they want, because none of the system makes sense anyway. I think that's what they're trying to get to.
Well, we don't understand it. Who knows what habeas corpus is?
Exactly.
It sounds like a very good appetizer. I don't know. You don't know. Let's call the whole thing fascism. We're talking to Traci Feit Love, the founder of Lawyers for Good Government. And I want to go back to this question. Last week, again, Supreme Court heard arguments from the Trump representee, the U.S. Solicitor General, about rescinding birthright citizenship. And of all people, Justice Kavanaugh, do you like beer? I guess Justice Kavanaugh also is trying to wrap his very beer broken brain around the implementation of something like getting rid of birthright citizenship. Take a listen.
On the day after it goes into effect, this is just a very practical question, how this is going to work. What do hospitals do with a newborn? What do states do with a newborn?
I don't think they do anything different. What the executive order says in Section 2 is that federal officials do not accept documents that have the wrong designation of citizenship from people who are subject to the executive order.
How are they going to know that?
The states can continue to, the federal officials will have to figure that out.
How?
So you could imagine a number of ways that the federal officials could.
Such as
They could require a showing of, documentation showing legal presence in the country. For a temporary visitor, for example, they could see whether they're on a B1 visa, which would exclude kind of the birthright citizenship in that country.
For all the newborns? Is that how that's going to work?
Again, we don't know.
There you have it. How? Such as? I mean, other documentation. It's it does kind of feel, to your point, that it's making something that was already Byzantine, even more Byzantine, unnecessarily, almost to, I think the argument that I'm hearing you make is to kind of do a self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, now, since we've got all of these new undocumented immigrants that have just been born into this country, it justifies our Gestapo even more, our ICE brigades.
Exactly.
It justifies patrolling hospitals we're talking about infants.
Yes. And listen to what he said, right? He said the states will continue to do what they're doing, and then the federal government will take it from there. We'll figure out who's really a citizen. We'll figure out what their legal, what the status of their parents was. We'll take care of it. We don't know how. We're not going to provide any specifics. We don't have to. Just trust us. We're on top of this. We're going to figure it out. It makes no sense unless you're trying to get to a point where there is nothing that anyone can rely on. It all comes down to, does the federal government like you or not? And if they don't, they can dig into your history. They can go back to your birth certificate. They can challenge whatever they want to challenge. But as long as they like you and you're pretty much doing what they say and towing the party line, then don't worry, you'll be fine. It's a terrifying argument.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do